Welcome back to Real Conversations with Johnnie Finch. Today I have Michael Digafe here with me. He's an MBA from Hopkins University. For some years, he worked for IBM, where he took the sales spin from 15 million to 37 million. Since then, he moved on to Mindtree Media, where he has a wealth of responsibilities, which he'll explain. He analyzes business like no other man I have ever met. And so I had to make sure that I brought him on. Also, at the same time, even though his schedule is demanding, he's able to maintain stability and his mindset so he can perform at optimal heights. Michael Digafe, let's go. Real Conversations.
Welcome back, Lawyer Life Live, Real Conversations, but we're not live. First, I got to pay some bills. This show is not sponsored by Bang, but it's a good drink. It'll keep you going. I'm going to email you guys, and maybe y'all can do something for me, but I drink that a lot. Also, Five Guys has some great burgers. They're not a sponsor either, but you guys might want to try it. Today, I have my guy here, Mr. Mike Digafe. 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 Mr. Show Me the Money. What's up, dude?
What's going on, Johnny? I got to say, I love the intro, man. I love the intro. Why wait for the sponsor to come to you, right? Go to them.
Well, hey, man, listen, they're going to know when this one goes 1 billion views what time it is. Right. Your last name is
you're 100% right.
Man. What's up? Where you from, dude?
I'm from Ethiopia. Ethiopia.
Okay. Originally, were you born there or?
Yeah. Born there. I was born there. I grew up there. I left when I was 5 years old, though. My whole family's from Ethiopia, born and raised. But my dad worked for ExxonMobil, the oil company, when I was a kid. So we ended up leaving Ethiopia when I was 5 years old. We moved to Ivory Coast in West Africa. So he got transferred with his job, became an expat. So we moved to Ivory Coast for 3 years. And then from Ivory Coast, we moved back to East Africa to Kenya, lived there for 2 years. And then we moved to the States when I was 10. I've been here since.
Man, that's quite a rich cultural beginning you had, dude. So your dad worked for Exxon. What did your mom work outside of the home at all?
She did when I got older, but not when I was growing up.
Okay.
She basically took, she raised me and my brother when eventually when he was born. He's 5 years younger than me. But no, yeah, it's a great childhood. It's funny because when people hear my last name, they always get confused. They never know where I'm from. So when I tell them I'm Ethiopian, the second that sticks out to them is they hear my accent and they say, "Well, that doesn't sound very Ethiopian." Like I end up speaking like that. But no, I had a great childhood. My parents afforded me great opportunities to live and study across the world. I went to, as you can tell, accent-wise, I went to private schools growing up in different parts of Africa, right? So when you work for a lot of people don't know this, when you work for a multinational, they end up taking care of a lot of the living expenses. So you get a house to live in with your family. They take care of the school, so you get access to world-class education that they subsidize, so you don't have to pay anything out of pocket. So yeah, I went to international schools growing up. Yeah, so by the time I moved to the States, I was 10. There's obviously going to be an acclimation period, right? That cultural clash that everybody speaks of, and the acclimation takes a while. But I think from a language perspective and in terms of understanding the culture around it, it wasn't too hard for me.
I got you. Now you said multinational for the nine MBAs. What's a what is it? Multinational company?
Yeah, multinational. Yeah. Different people use different terms, right? So it could be multinational, it could be global. Any organization that has a footprint in obviously multiple countries, right? Multinationalities. So ExxonMobil at the time, it still is. I'd have to check the stock price after the oil market crash, but it is one of the largest companies in the world. It's got a footprint everywhere. Anywhere where oil could be dug out of the ground, drilled, and produced, they've got a footprint. So my dad worked in, and funny enough, in IT. So he's a programmer and engineer by trade. And what ended up happening was he got a job as a contractor for ExxonMobil in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and he got turned from a contractor into a full-time employee because they appreciated the work that he did. He was working on an IT project. When the project finished, he got afforded the opportunity to work on a similar project in Ivory Coast. Now think about how crazy that is, right? If you're, my dad was young when he had me, right? So I was 5 years old when I left. He was about my age now. I'm 30 years old. He was 31 about the time we left. And somebody, if you live in Ethiopia, somebody calls you out of the blue one day and says, "Hey, great project for you, great opportunity, but it's in Ivory Coast," right? Can you imagine picking up the phone, taking your Ethiopian family, right, one of the most homogenous countries in the world, to a francophone speaking country, right? That's what Ivory Coast is. It's a French speaking former French colony. But yeah, I loved it, man. I had a fantastic childhood. I spoke French fluently when I was a kid. I still speak a little bit, but obviously I forgot it through the years. But yeah, I had a phenomenal childhood. Yeah.
So you learned French once you moved to the Ivory Coast, or you already knew it?
No, I learned it when I was there. So I started kindergarten when I first moved there. Went to first, second, third grade there. Spoke it fluently there. I mean, there's videos of me as a kid. I didn't speak English until I moved to. I started speaking English when I moved to Ivory Coast, but it was my second language, right? So I spoke Amharic, which I still do. It's my first language, Ethiopian. I spoke French as my second language because that's their primary language when you're there. And then they taught you English as a secondary language in those schools because that's it's an international school, right? So there's people from all cultures, backgrounds from all over the world. But I spoke French first, eventually English, and then when I moved to Kenya, it's funny how a kid's brain works, right? When I moved to Kenya, I went to a British private school, and within a year, my French just completely disappeared.
Yeah, nobody's using it.
Yeah.
So your dad, was he college educated?
He was college educated. He incredibly smart guy, man. He's he is the opposite of me, where I like to think my skills are qualitative in nature, right? My ability to communicate, to relate to people. He is your nerd's nerd. He's incredibly smart man. Incredibly smart man. But yeah, he's college educated. He got an engineering degree. But he's always been a self-made man. I mean, he teaches himself everything. To this very day. Whenever they live pretty close by in Fairfax, Virginia. I live in DC. Whenever I'm going there, his version of a Friday night out or a Saturday night out is he signs up for classes on Coursera. And like the other day, I went to go see him for my mom's birthday, and I was asking how's everything going at home. My mom goes, "It's like, yeah, things are cool. Your dad's doing what he's doing. He actually just graduated." And I'm like, "What do you mean graduated?" So I asked him, I was like, what have you been doing? He's like, "Yeah, I just finished this 32-week course." I was like, 32 weeks. I was like, that's a lot of effort. I was like, "What are you studying?" He goes, "Yeah, I taught myself how to do machine learning and NLP, natural language processing." I'm like, man, that's the kind of stuff I hear about at work. Like I'm in the business. I work in enterprise IT, right? I'm in the business of selling those assets, but I don't actually have to do it. He can actually do it. So it goes to show you the differences there.
So growing up, did your parents have a track that they wanted you to go on, or were they just kind of like, just do well in school and choose what you want, or how'd that work growing up?
That's a good question. So my parents were incredibly encouraging, right? So they always wanted to make sure I was doing good as far as education was concerned. They anything I wanted for school, whether it was extra, courses, if I wanted to tutor, they always went above and beyond. But they never really said, I want you to be a doctor, or I want you to be a lawyer, sort of, the quote unquote, you always hear the typical immigrant story, right? And Africans are no different. They always want you to go towards the guaranteed sort of STEM jobs. But my parents were pretty hands off. They wanted me to make sure that I was doing good in school, but they always afforded me the luxury of kind of picking the path that I wanted to choose, which is ironic because, I look back to the career that I got into. A big part of that was just kind of seeing how my dad operated, right? I was always curious as to, he worked in tech, at the time, enterprise IT, obviously, but he worked in tech. He was always fascinated by technology. He'd take me to the library, when I was in elementary school, middle school. He always gets me books on, like Nikola Tesla or, Einstein or Edison. And so he naturally kind of birthed that curiosity at me as far as technology was concerned. But he never really told me, I want you to focus on this or this. I kind of just stumbled into it by myself, just by virtue of watching it.
I see. And what you stumbled into was, wow. Okay, so I meet Mike for the first time, and we're having this conversation. And he's putting all this different knowledge at me, and as he's talking, I'm slowly but surely becoming a fan. I'm like, what the hell do you do, Mike? It kind of went like that because when you have a conversation with people, a lot of the times it will kind of be glaring what this person does. If they say, "Yeah, I did that surgery," okay, that surgery, all right. So Mike is a businessman. He's a legitimate businessman by trade. Which, I mean, let's just fast forward. You went to Johns Hopkins. You got your master's in business administration. You get your first job at a major computer company. They go from somewhere around 18 million to somewhere around 50 million was the work that you were doing. Right. What was it about you that made them say that they wanted you in charge of that money?
Yeah, it's a good question. I remember the first time I met you. It was pretty funny, right? So I don't know if your audience knows this, but one of my best friends from high school, Pignell, is your sister-in-law.
Shout out.
And I remember when I first met you the first time. You weren't peppering me with questions, but you're a naturally curious person. And I'll be honest with you, right? I've always struggled to explain what I do for a living, right? It's not one of those jobs where somebody asks you what are you doing. I'm like, oh, I'm a doctor. I'm a pediatric surgeon, or I work for a grocery store. It's always been hard to define, but yeah. So I got my MBA from Johns Hopkins. And I was really young, right? So I got into business school when I was 22. So let me give you a little more background for that, right? So I graduated early from college, so I was pretty young going into the workforce. I was 20 years old.
VCU?
Yeah, VCU.
I
went to Virginia Commonwealth University. I got my my bachelor's in business administration. I graduated in 3 years, and I came out thinking the world was going to give me a job on a platter, right? I think a lot of people are young, sort of naive and young enough to think the world is my oyster. And I ended up getting a decent job. I worked for a startup, and I worked in the call center for the first 2 years. I started off as a person that would pick up the phone. Somebody would come in, they'd have a question about the software that they were using, and I would answer the question for them, right? But I picked on them pretty quick. I got promoted a couple times, and within 2 years, I ended up running the call center, right? A 24/7 operation. I had about 30 people working for me. But then the company got bought out.
In 2 years?
In 2 years, yeah. But then the company got bought out by a private equity firm, right? So they're a small, startup company. They specialized in software for criminal justice reform, not criminal justice reform, but the criminal justice industry. And when they got bought out by a private equity firm, they wanted to relocate the entire operations suite from Northern Virginia to Houston. So I had already started studying for the GMAT at the time, and I decided, I wasn't really feeling the idea of moving to Houston it was a good job, and it wasn't like I was making, crazy amount of money or saw a trajectory that was going to take me to where I wanted to go. So yeah, I got my MBA from Johns Hopkins, and when I graduated, I got an offer to work for IBM. Right, that's the company you're referring to earlier, and I joined them through a leadership development program. So they recruit somewhere between 30 and 35 MBAs, at least at the time, from across the country, and they put you through a rotation program. So you spend 6 to 9 months basically going through training. They train you in terms of how they want their sort of quote unquote sellers performing their function. They've got a very IBM way of doing it. They give you a chance to work for a local team, in my case in Washington, D.C. And but you had 35 other MBAs from across the country, right? From the West Coast, East Coast, and everywhere in between. And we'd meet up, somewhere in the middle of the country every couple of weeks, right? So it could be North Carolina, we went to Vegas a couple of times, New York. They'd fly you out, and you basically, sort of share your experiences together. You train together, and then eventually, when you finish the program, you get into the actual job itself, right? So I became what's known as a global client executive, which is a fancy way of saying I was in charge of enterprise sales. So yeah, I worked as a client exec for 5 years. And what does that mean, right? What does a client exec do? So this is the part where it gets interesting.
We're running out of years, man, because you're 30, man. So I didn't know that we were running out of years. Let me rewind just a little bit. There was a portion of time, right when your first job was slowing down, you had made your way to the top of the call center, and they were moving to Houston, but you didn't see the trajectory there. Let us know a little bit about how you did the analysis on whether you were going to go and get your MBA or whether you're going to move to Houston, and why you ultimately decided it was better to get your MBA than to go to Houston with the company you had been with for 2 years.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the funny thing is, man, and I'm sure I'm not the only person that goes through this, right? When you're young, and young is relative, right? You could be my age at the time. I was 21, 22 years old. You could be 30 years old. It's all relative to experiences gone through in life. It's hard for you to gauge what a career is and where it is relative to other professions, other careers, other trajectories, other paths, right? It's still incredibly hard. I mean, I like to think I have a pretty wide network now. People I've worked with that I've gone to school with, friends that kind of give me a barometer in terms of where their careers are that can kind of compare where I am in terms of where I want to be, right? But at the time when you're 22, my only comparison point was basically how much money I was making and where I was living, right? So I wasn't making that much money. I was making $25 an hour, which was good for me at the time. I was living with my parents. I was saving money. I just finished school.
You baller.
I mean, you joke about that, but at the time, that's a lot of money. $25, $25 an hour is a lot of money in your pocket.
And then with the past, man.
Yeah. No, it was a decent amount of money. But I think the thing that got to me was I'd done relatively decent, in that job. You know, in a matter of 2 years, I'd gone to running, you know, a call center. I don't know what that meant. I never worked for another call center. I never worked for another company. So I didn't know if that was a big deal, if it wasn't a big deal. I don't know if my salary was where it should be. And when they called you and they say, hey, look, you know, we want you to move to Houston with this job, you know, a big part of me goes, is it worth me moving to Texas just for this job, right? Is there enough value there for me? And it's actually pretty funny. So what ended up happening was, and I hadn't made my decision at the time. So I told you I studied for my GMAT. I'd been in the process of applying for business school, just sort of as a fail-safe option, right? Just like something I can fall back on, just in case this doesn't work out for me. And it's funny, the day I went to go interview with Hopkins, I had to go to work in the morning, and I was going to go drive to Baltimore in the afternoon for my interview. So I'm at work in the morning, and mind you, it's a pretty casual startup culture, right? So people wear jeans, you know, maybe a polo, but nothing crazy. But I was fully suited up, right? I had a full suit and tie on. I told my boss, I was like, hey, I'm gonna leave in a couple hours. I'm gonna go to Baltimore. And it turns out, so they already been acquired at that time. The private equity firm was doing their due diligence in Northern Virginia at the time. So, you know, they're walking around the office, they're talking to different people. Their due diligence basically means you're looking at the books, you're looking at how the company operates, just to make sure you understand what you're going to go into. And one of their guys saw me in the call center. He's like, who's that guy with a suit on? You know? And my boss at the time, I remember him like it was yesterday, Jamie Bennett, said, you know, hey, I got this kid, you know, running my call center for him. He's like 22 years old. He's kind of brash and he talks a lot, but you know, he gets the job done, all right? So for whatever reason, the guy like pulled me aside right before I left. He's like, hey, I want to talk to you for 30 minutes. You know, I kind of want to get a feel for what you do. So, yeah, he pulled me aside and he said, hey, you know, we don't typically get a lot of people that work in our call centers going to business school. Like, what makes you, you know, what made you get interested into that? Like, what are you interested in doing, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, it's funny because I kind of flipped it around on him because I knew who he was. I'd done some research on him. He wasn't just a PE investor. He was a venture capitalist. And if you looked at his LinkedIn, I still have him on LinkedIn. He's actually one of my first ads as a young boy back in the day. You know, he listed the different companies he invested in, and I started just peppering him with questions. You know, I said, hey, you know, I see that you're investing in clean energy. You know, what makes you think that's going to be the path forward? You know, I started asking him about a bunch of different companies in portfolio. And by the time he wrapped up, he said something to me that really stuck out, which was, you know, he repeated the thing. He said, I don't typically see people like you working in a call center. Like, if you feel like you have a future elsewhere, you know, after business school, give me a call. I think you have an opportunity to do something bigger than this. Ooh. And I think that for me was sort of the clincher in my head that, hey, you know, there probably is something bigger and better for me there. You know, rather than move to Houston, you know, making maybe $5 an extra hour and kind of just continue climbing up a little bit further, maybe there was a chance for me to kind of take a step back, go back to school, you know, really invest in myself and learn for a couple of years and kind of use that as an accelerant going forward, right? So I'm a big proponent of, you know, whatever next job I take, the next step that I take, I don't like taking linear paths. I don't like going from A to B, right? I try to find a way to go from A to F, G, H, whatever it may be. And you got to find different ways of doing that, right? Whether it's going to business school, getting education, whether it's through networking, contacts, or any other path available to you. But that's how I looked at that opportunity for me, right? Stepping back, going to business school was a chance for me to go from making $25 an hour to potentially becoming, you know, something that I thought would be more legitimate for me in the long run for my career.
So, I mean, but even with that, being able to go at that early on in 2 years to running the call center, where did you get this confidence from, man, coming out of undergrad? I mean,
that's a good question.
There were a lot of people with their bachelor's degrees in the call center, maybe?
Right.
Yes, no?
Not really.
Okay. But still, okay.
Yeah, there were some, you know, but it wasn't like a 50-50 ratio, maybe.
Sure. So, I mean, but your confidence, man, I mean, you exude it, man, and I know it's because of what's in your brain. I mean, parts of your looks too. Kind of. But since a young child, we always really confident in your skills and your ability. Because I mean, I don't know when I met the first millionaire or, you know, venture capitalist type. I don't know what age I was at that time, but certainly right. I would have been drooling at 21, 22 years old, or maybe I would have just been so, you know, ignorant to the experience. You know, sometimes, you know, you're just so young and you're just like, hey, I'm just going to talk to this guy. But where'd you get your confidence from, man?
You know, it's funny. People ask about confidence all the time, right? And look, I mean, confidence is a personality trait to some extent, right? So everybody has an inherent.
I kind of know you too, right?
Yeah, you know, I'm sure you've seen me. You know, I have a natural, you know, personality that kind of sticks out in some regards. But I mean, if I look at it from a professional standpoint, I'm a firm believer that, you know, being prepared and being knowledgeable is why you're confident, right? Uh-huh. I genuinely enjoy technology. I enjoy business. I enjoy every part of it. You know, if I look at what I do on a day-to-day basis, even if I don't have the job that I have, I wake up every morning and I literally cycle through on my phone, reading the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, read, TechCrunch, The Verge, Bloomberg. I pride myself on being very knowledgeable, right? I like knowing what's going on in the industry. I like, if you look at the, if you look at really what investing is, right, or what being a quote unquote business person is, it really is who can observe the most, right? Who can observe what's going on in the marketplace and the world long enough to understand where trends are going, and how do you take advantage of those trends, right? So I didn't look. I mean, it's easy for me to say that now, but I didn't know what that was at that time, right? When I was a kid, I was just inherently curious about these things, right? So when I take that, the VC guy that I was telling you about as an example. Look, I probably should have been a little, maybe, not scared, but like a little bit nervous in terms of, sort of his pedigree and where he was coming from. But I wasn't, because if I looked at, the research I did on him, I was naturally curious about those things, right? I wasn't asking him to be, to suck up to him or like try to get a job with him. I was generally curious, right? You were in the business of allocating capital. You spend, you literally allocate millions of dollars every year across things that you believe give you a better return on that equity than you otherwise would. So I was curious as to how he made those decisions, because I only been in a position one day to make those decisions, right? So if I get 30 minutes with you, sure, I could sit there and shoot the shit, or I could try to draw out as much knowledge, firsthand out of you as I can, rather than having to rely on third-party sources, which is what I usually do by reading, right? Because at that time, you got to realize when you're 21, 22, you don't really have a network, right? My network was my friends, people I went to school with, maybe people I interact with on my job. But I hadn't built a business or professional sort of network around me where if I had questions about finance, if I had questions about venture capitalists, if I had even domain level questions about different industries, right? I didn't know if I could pick up the phone and call somebody. So he was one of the first people I kind of latched onto to say, hey, if I got some time with you, let me try to draw out as much of that knowledge as I can. So so preparation is where you get confidence from, right? If you have a natural curiosity and you back that up by doing just the hardcore research it takes to kind of nurture that, you tend to be very confident about how you speak and talk about that.
So would you say that was kind of your confirmation that you were definitely going to, or had you already decided you were going to go get your MBA at that point?
I think I was definitely leaning towards it, and that probably confirmed it for me. That and the fact I got a scholarship, about 3 months afterwards. So by the time they decided to subsidize the cost of me attending, I said it's a no-brainer for me. So yeah.
Yeah. Who should not consider getting an MBA?
That's a good question, man. A lot of people should not consider getting an MBA. So I love my MBA experience, right? When I say I loved it, I generally loved it. I didn't make any money for 2 years, right? Outside of being a graduate assistant for part of that time and being an intern in between for year 1 and year 2. But if I look at why I enjoy the experience, right? I was in a position in my career where a couple of things had kind of fallen for me, right? One is I had worked to some extent, right? So, I was still pretty young. Like I told you, I was 20 years old when I graduated undergrad, and I was 22 by the time I started business school. But I had worked for about 1.5 years, 2 years in between to kind of get a semblance of what the professional world was like, right? I think fundamentally the first part is I had a lot of people in my graduating class that went straight from undergraduate to graduate school, right? And I still see that now, right? I mean, I still talk to folks from Hopkins every once in a while when a kid reaches out to me and asks for advice or where else it may be, even at my job. And for folks that they're not in a position to really understand how you can apply all the academic theoretical sort of knowledge that comes out of business school, you really should work for 1 year or 2 before you start thinking about that, right? So that's fundamental number one. I think the second part of it is, at least from my perspective, I told you about the fact that I look, business school is no different than any other investment you make in life, right? You're deciding to say, if you do it full time, you decided to take a step back for 2 years. You're paying the opportunity cost of not making an income for those 2 years because you think that investment is going to, triple, quadruple itself over a period of time. So for folks that look at business school as sort of just the next step up in terms of where they're going, for some people, I think that may make a difference. If you're at a point in your career where you're kind of hitting the proverbial ceiling and you need this to kind of crash through it, then yeah, go for it, right? But be very cautious because you only get.
So guys, let me help you. If you've been in your career for a little while, you kind of know what's going on. You can kind of see a bridge between maybe going to get your MBA and where it's going to go with the information that you already have. Mike is saying maybe that it may be a good idea for you then, but not on a clean slate. Am I?
Look, it varies depending on the person, right? It really does. you can look at it in different ways, right? You can look at it from just a pure number standpoint, which is it cost me X period of time, X amount of dollars to do this initiative, right? Which is graduate school. So whether you're doing an MBA or if you're getting your JD or MD, whatever the case may be, you got to ask yourself, right? Is this investment going to be worth it at the end of the day, right? Can I look at myself in the mirror 2 years after I'm done with this, and if I look at the return I'm getting on that investment, right, which in a lot of cases is going to be your salary, is it equitable enough for me to make that logical decision, right?
And you quit your job to go to grad school.
Yeah.
So what was your link? Was it the fact that you enjoyed business so much, or the nature around business and everything that came with it, that you kind of said, hey, I love this enough. If anybody can navigate it, I can? Or what was it? Because obviously you did this analysis yourself when you chose to go to business. It wasn't dentistry, or it wasn't. Sometimes you know what you're gonna do. Like, you go to dentistry, you're gonna be it.
Yeah. No, the only other profession I would have considered at that point was law school. So I looked at a couple of different ways, right? So for one, the question was, am I going to go to graduate school in general, right? So would I plan on getting a master's degree of some sort after I'm done with this? And it became pretty clear to me, I think, by the time I started working a year or two out of school, that the answer was going to be yes, right? It was between a combination of different things, right? Everything from, my parents had always insisted to me, even as a kid, that they wanted me to get a master's degree. And they insisted on it enough times where I kind of had to open my eyes in terms of understanding what that meant. Two, and I think more critically for me was, when the company that I was working for at the time, right, with the call center, when they got acquired, you start looking at, okay, what am I going to do after this, right? If I'm not going to go work for them in Houston, Texas, what am I going to do after this that's going to give me the next launching point of my career, right? And I just didn't see anything out there that I think would have made the same difference in my life at that particular point in time as going to business school would have been, right? And that's really what it boiled down to, right? It came down to the opportunity cost of taking myself out of the job market for 2 years at what I thought would have been a X income, relative to if I really immersed myself at a relatively prestigious university for 2 years, bust my ass off, do what I have to do, network, leverage that experience to take the next step in my career. Can I make that jump from A to Y and Z as opposed to A to B, right? And I felt pretty confident that experience would have exposed me to enough where I could have made that jump. And for me, it became a no-brainer pretty early on in the process.
Yeah, and you didn't have a lot to lose.
I did. I mean, I was balling at $25 an hour, but at the end of the day, it wasn't that much money, right? Picked up a couple extra bar tabs on a weekend when I was having fun, but it wasn't like I had a mortgage to pay. I don't have a family to support. The opportunity cost for me wasn't as risky as it would be if you're 28 years old, 30 years old, if you have a mortgage to pay, if you got kids, if you got a family. You're looking at this in the context of like a much more refined timeline that I think a lot of people are accustomed to. Yeah, my calculus would have been a little different, right? But at that point in my life, man, I was living relatively simple. I had no debt. I just wasn't as much risk on my shoulder to take advantage of that as it would have been if you look at me now where I'm 30 years old, right? Now I've got a couple mortgages to pay. I got responsibilities, my family. It's a very different calculus in terms of how I approached it.
I see. And then grad school, you focused in entrepreneurship and right? And marketing.
Yeah.
Like, so when I hear those words, man, I hear a lot. Like, that's a lot of information. And that's probably why when I look at your job description, I see that you're doing so many different things. I mean, goodness gracious, man. That was, programming 2 years. What was it, 16 credit hours or 18 credit hours a semester or 21? What was going on with that? That's a lot of information.
Yeah. No, keep in mind, right? So an MBA is very different, I think, in some regards compared to like a bachelor's where you focus on like a core subject area, right? So I'd say probably about any MBA, 50-60% of the content is going to be about the same, right? You're all going through the same, finance classes. You're all going through the same ethics classes, the same econ classes, the same communication classes. It's a pretty defined sort of foundational program, right? Think about what MBA is, right? It's a generalist degree, right? It allows you to kind of fluctuate to different parts of the business, different parts of the economy, depending on what your skill sets are. But it's foundationally a very generalist degree. Now, I'll be honest with you, the reason I decided to focus on marketing and entrepreneurship was twofold, right? One is I wanted to take advantage of the fact that I'm not working for 2 years to look at are there different things I can do from my perspective to start a business or launch myself to starting a business after I'm done? And two, right, and this is the part my friends from business school hear this is, I'm not quantitatively inclined, right? I'm not a numbers person. I'm not a, you know, I had a.
I'm using that for the rest of my life. I'm not quantitatively inclined. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, right, I think the most common, most popular focus in an MBA program is finance, right? A lot of people go into investment banking, they go into finance, all kinds of different parts of the banking world. And you know, I had friends that you know, I have a friend Steven who he's just a borderline genius when it comes to numbers, right? He does not have to go into a class. He can see a concept, you know, from a number perspective, pick up on it relatively quickly and just get it, right? Where I didn't have that same proclivity, nor did I have the interest in doing that, right? To me, numbers has always been a means to an end. It's never been the end all be all. So I naturally, I think within the first semester, when I realized how hard it was, I was like, you know what, man, I'm gonna focus on my strong suits, right? I'm good at marketing, I'm good at communication. I want to be able to leverage this experience to start a business. Let me try to hone in on the skills. So it's the old age adage, right? It's you know, do you keep sharpening the iron, your skills, or do you focus on the one that's weak? I decided to hone in on my strengths, right? I wanted to make them stronger. I wanted to really focus on that and see that as sort of my calling card, as opposed to trying to refine what I thought were weaknesses.
What and how do you feel about that, man? As far as what do they say, doubling down on your strengths and kind of leaning away from your weaknesses when it comes to things. I mean, how does that work in business when you don't necessarily have that $3 billion budget?
Right. It's a good question, right? So if I look at what I do now for a living, you know, I have to deal with, you know, the numbers, right? If you want to call it that, right? I have a budget. I have to look at, you know, payroll numbers. I have to look at, you know, I draw proposals, so I'm responsible for pricing. I probably wish I spent a little more time just kind of intuitively grasping some of this. But if I'm being really honest with you, if I look at the experience that came out of business school, a lot of my learnings did not come from the actual classroom itself, right? If I look at, you know, what I've been able to leverage that really helped me as far as the career that I've embarked on, and where I look at my strong skills now and my skill set, a lot of that comes from I think what I did in business school, right? I doubled down on my advantages, right? I really focus in on what I'm good at. You know, obviously I try to, you know, to sharpen the edges around where I may not be good at and try to focus on those as well. But I really try to focus on that. And then I focus on building a team around me that can mitigate for my shortcomings, right? So if you look at my team around me right now, you know, I am probably the most verbose of people, right? I'm the one that deals with my customers. I'm the one that interacts with the stakeholders the most. But, you know, I've got a really sharp team around me that handles all the other things that I'm not going to be the A player on. And I think collectively as a team, right, we kind of hone in on together, make sure, you know, overall everything works the way it should.
Yeah, man. That's a lot of pressure. It sounds like a lot of pressure. It sounds like
it's not, man. It's not. Life is not pressure, man. This is not you know, I look at, you know, what I may have considered to be pressureful moments, and you know, I got thrown into the wolves when I was IBM, right? I was 24 years old, managing you know, $1 million accounts pretty early on, and you know, it really taught me one of two things, right? One is I'll tell you a story, right? When I started IBM, one of the first clients I took over was it was an energy company based out of Northern Virginia. They had signed enterprise outsourcing deal with us, right? So for those that are familiar, outsourcing basically means you take a core functionality within your business, you decide, I don't want to spend as much money on it, or do I want to hire as many people in this area because it's not a core part of my business, right? I'm not in the business of managing a data center. I'm not in the business of building applications. I'd rather focus my core competencies elsewhere. Let me give it to a third party that can handle this better than me. So that's a big part of IBM does is that, right? It takes away these sort of not commoditized, but these non-essential sort of services that organizations say, you know what, I'm an energy company, I'm in healthcare, I'm in school, I'm in banking. I'm not in the business of doing IT. What am I doing, right? Let me just give this off to you guys. You guys are professional. You're world class at what you do. Let me just give that to you. So long story short, I was working at this energy company, and I was young. I was 24 years old. The boss I was working for at the time had an incredible amount of faith in me, probably a little too much than he should have. And he put me in charge of a you know, it's not that substantial now that I look at it, but like it was pretty hefty. It was a contract that paid out about $10 million a year. And within the first 2 weeks of me taking over, we had a pretty critical outage, right? So I got an email I got an email Saturday morning. It was like 8 o'clock in the morning from the CIO. Oh, sorry, the email wasn't to me. I was just looped into, I was CC'd on a thread, right? And it was a CIO of the company talking to, some boss five rungs above me. I don't know who anybody was at the time. But they're basically saying, hey, look, we got a massive outage. You guys did something in our data center. You basically knocked off our for those familiar, they run their financials on a system called SAP. It was hosted in our data center. We knocked it out. Long story short, they were at risk of not meeting their financial. They were at risk of not being able to report their financial results in that quarter. So all the stuff was going on in the background. I didn't really know what was going on, and I get called. I got called Sunday night by my boss. He said, "Hey, look, we have to go to their office on Monday for a meeting. Give an update on where we are, kind of walk them through the situation, what happened, how we're going to resolve it, sort of basic, stakeholder management, right?" So we get into the conference room. Beautiful office, right? Her office is on the 13th floor of this high rise in Arlington, Virginia, and we're sitting at a round table. It's me, my boss, the guy that actually ran the delivery side, so the day-to-day sort of project management functions, and a couple other executives that flown in just for this meeting, right? Because it was an important customer. Then it was her. She's the global CIO. She had a CTO next to her. She had a bunch of different folks within the IT organization and various leadership functions. And it was my first time meeting her, right? So my boss had given me the account, but she didn't know who I was. So we were sitting there. My boss, Pat O'Donnell at the time, great guy. He says, hey, let me introduce you to Michael. He just recently joined our team. He's going to be responsible for handling this relationship for us on a day-to-day basis going forward. Get to know him a little bit better because he's going to be your go-to guy going forward, right? And he says, Michael, give you a little bit about your background. And keep in mind, I'm 24 years old. I just joined IBM, right? My working experience at the time amounted to basically business school, 6 months at IBM, and 2 years working at a call center, right? So I introduced a little bit about myself, and some other folks on the IBM side had met some other folks on the client side. So we did a full round of introductions. So I'm sitting in the front of the table. She's sitting to the right of me. So I start the introduction here, and it loops around in a big circle, comes back around, right? So she's the last person, and she goes, "Hey, my name is I probably shouldn't say her name, but my name is Elizabeth. I've been the global CIO here now for a couple of years. We signed this deal with IBM because we really relied on your reputation, your brand, your world-class expertise to do blah blah blah." And then she looked at Pat and said, "Pat, you were part of this process when we signed this deal, and you've been at IBM for 30 plus years. I'd be curious to kind of hear from you and in terms of how, what happened and what you guys are doing to mitigate this going forward." And she looked at me and she goes, "Michael, it's like, how long have you been working with Pat?" And I was like, "Oh, he hired me a couple months ago. I've been training under him, but I understand this account better than anything." And she looks at me
at that point.
Well, I mean, my heart it wasn't beating. You kind of you knew what you're signing up for. When my heart started beating was when she looked at me and she goes. She asked me how long I've been working with him. I said a couple of months, and she goes, "Yeah, he's been IBM for 30 plus years. Great guy to learn from." And she looked at me and she goes, "Have you been alive for that long?" I was like, "Oh man," I was like, "Oh shit," I literally looked like the youngin. You see my quarantine beard right now, but at the time I thought it'd be smarter for me not to have a beard. So I had a baby face. I looked a lot younger than I do now, so I literally stuck out in the crowd. So when she said that, yeah, my heart started beating fast. It was one of the few times in my life, in my career, I felt out of place.
Oh man, but I mean, hey, this particular point in time, man, he like, even though it's like 8 years, it was like 20 years of the game, man. I mean, if anybody asks you anything right now, you could just throw those numbers out, man. That's what can throw those numbers out too. So, when it comes to business, and your MBA, seems like the key phrases: entrepreneurship, marketing. Then you always hear brand. Now, again, that's a very, very generic term, but how do you define brand?
How do I define brand? That's a good question. That's a really good question. I mean, if you think about it, right? I mean, a brand is basically what attracts people, right? So, whether it's a brand that you buy, it's a brand that you attend, there's a certain attraction to it that sort of removes the inhibition from a customer perspective to say, I want to do something, but I'm willing to do it because this brand is associated with it, right? So if the way I look at brand is pretty simple. It's credibility. Mm-hmm. Is there a credibility associated with a brand that I can trust, that I want to be associated with if I'm willing to buy from it, if I'm willing to invest in it, if I'm willing to be around it, right? So I don't look at it the same way as I do. I think our generation has got the notion of brand, sort of flipped around, right? I mean, if you think about it in this day and age, people talk about, my brand, my platform, right, is a pretty common word. And I'll say this, right? Kudos to people that are looking at it from that perspective, because at the end of the day, trying to build a brand for yourself mean that you're investing in yourself and you're building to build a business around yourself, right? So I'm always for that. But at the same time, you have to look at yourself and say, what is it about me that leads to a brand being built? And what are the traits around that I feel like outsiders would want to associate with, that they want to associate with, right? What is it about me that other people are actually going to gravitate towards and come after, right? It can't be as simple as just saying, hey, I'm 21 years old or 22 years old. I look good. I party a lot. I have a lot of followers on Instagram. Thus, I must be a brand, right? I think for some people it could work that way, but I think those are few and far between. So I look at branding very differently, right? I look at branding from the perspective of businesses, right? I look at it from the brand of companies I work for, companies I work with. I look at it from clients that I work with, right? And how important they take the integrity of their brand, right? Which is very different, I think, if you look at it from the consumer marketplace. But yeah, I think credibility really sticks out in that regard.
Whenever I feel like big companies are pulling the wool over our eyes or kind of like pull the carpet from under us, I always think about you. So,
oh man, that sounds good.
I feel like they just did something, right? So there's no live sports right now, right? Yeah. There's no live sports. There's no NBA indefinitely.
Boy, do we miss it.
But then there's this gentleman by the name of Michael Jordan.
There is.
They come out with this, what is it, The Last Stand, The Last Dance.
Last Dance, yeah.
For 20 years. Michael Jordan has been retired for 20 years. All of a sudden, nobody cares about live sports, because everybody is watching Mike. When you think about what ESPN, what is your business brain say to you about what it did? Did they take our eagerness for live sports and just like take Michael Jordan, throw him in the mix and just fool us? And then we're not even complaining anymore. What did they do? It's a trick, right? Is this a trick? Is that as a business?
I mean,
trick?
So there's a few ways you can think about this, right? And so this is a part. So I love, just be clear with your viewers, right? I love the confluence of business and sports, right? If I look at my two biggest passions in life, business, sports are that's my thing. That's my jam, right? So if I get a little too granular, right, just cut me off. So it's interesting, right? The Last Dance, and it's 7/21 Sunday, May 3rd right now. I will be watching episodes 5 and 6 eagerly in about an hour and a half, right? So you're talking to basically like your prime consumer from that regard, right? I live and breathe this. So if you look at the original thesis of the documentary, right? So for one, it was planned on being released around the time the NBA Finals would have been played, right? The plan ESPN had at the time was play it on the off nights in between the finals, right? As basically a mechanism to keep your ratings, sort of linear as opposed to going up and down over that period of time, right? So the final times are bonanzas for the networks, right? The reason why the NBA gets paid billions and billions of dollars for TV rights is primarily because of the playoffs. I mean, obviously the volume of content they provide over a year plays a big role. But if you look at the biggest time, everybody's tuned in, right? Whether it's the Super Bowl, whether it's the NHL Finals, the Stanley Cup, whether it's the NBA, playoffs, finals. That's your time to shine, right? So it's a mechanism for them to draw more ad dollars during that time. Now, obviously, the NBA season got canceled, March, whatever the date was. So they had to accelerate the release of the documentary, right, because of a massive gap in their schedule, right? They had basically nothing else showing. But if you look at the documentary though, right, it's actually pretty interesting. So the footage has been around for 22 years.
Right.
So the gentleman that you guys know as the NBA commissioner, Adam Silver, was at the time the head of NBA Entertainment, all right? So he came up with this plan along with, I forget the other gentleman's name, but he came up with this plan to basically say, hey, look, this Jordan guy is massive, right? I don't think this is going to be, I don't think our league is going to see anything as big as this. Can we convince him to put a documentary crew right behind the scenes and bet him into the team as part of this, part of the final season? And Jordan agreed, right? With the caveat that he has the final sign-off on whenever the footage sees the light of day. Now, for a multitude of different reasons, right? And people can speculate as to whatever they want to. The popular one out there is, Jordan has numerous vices that he does not want the world to see. It's going to affect his brand. To, just the sheer amount of money it was going to take to actually, to make the documentary, to get the release rights. All of that basically came to a head in 2016. So the story has it that during the Cavs, your boy LeBron's, championship win, during that victory parade, Jordan finally agreed to do the release. And a big part of it was ESPN and Netflix came to the table and said, look, we'll co-fund the release of a documentary like this, right? So think about that. From 2016 to where you are today is how long it took for them to shoot 10 hours or take the thousands of hours of footage, compile it into a linear storyline that the hardcore fan can listen to, but also your average sort of layman that knew who Jordan was, but not really into the details, but would want to tune into, right? To become this culture experience that you're seeing it right now. So a lot of different things had to come into play, right? You had to see the confluence of a Netflix-like player that's willing to invest millions and millions and millions and tens of millions of dollars to make something like this come true. You had to see the advent of long-form documentaries, right? So if you remember even as little as like 5 years ago, where, short, like you'd have documentaries that were an hour and a half, 2 hours tops, right? That was a long-form content you would speak of. You didn't see these multi-series documentaries come to fruition until people realized, hey, I can make a lot more money by actually stretching out the footage longer than I can condensing it, right? So you saw all these little variables kind of condense into this little massive package that came to fruition, where they greenlit it. And then even on top of that, if you look at probably the exponential increase in ratings that they would have had before the pandemic to where you are today, is because there was nothing else on TV, right? So they are fortuitous in the sense that they opened up this time slot for them, right? If you're the producer of the documentary, but if you're ESPN, I mean, you're still got a massive hole in your revenue base. I mean, they are hemorrhaging money left and right. So it's not going for as well for them as it could have been, but considering the circumstances, it's as good as it gets.
Man, I know Twitter, Instagram. Probably right now everybody's warming up for the Last Dance. So you got the ultimate brand, and then the great Kobe Bryant. He's no longer here with us, and then enters Mr. LeBron James. Now, to those of you who don't know, I'm not the biggest LeBron James fan on the court, on the court. But what I will say is, I cannot say anything bad about LeBron James as it comes to his business acumen. When you see LeBron and the moves that he makes, how much of an anomaly do you consider him from a business aspect?
Yeah. I mean, take away the greatness of LeBron the player, which can stand on its own pedestal to where he is as a businessman.
We ain't talking about that, man.
So I mean, you can look at it a couple of different ways, right? So if you look at it from the perspective of 2020, he's no longer abnormal in the kind of deals that he strikes. He's abnormal in a sense of the prestigiousness and the scale at which he's able to do it, right? But if you look at it from a pure, where were athletes doing a business 15, 20 years ago to where, to what he started doing, in the past, he's been in the league for 16 years now. You could call him a number of different things, but he's a visionary in that regard, right? He's one of the first people, I think, to really adapt the notion of entrepreneurship in the context of athletes. So think about where the league was when I was in high school, right? I graduated from high school in 2007, so he'd been in the league for 3 years at that point. But if you look at athletes around that peak time, the notion of how you build a business then was basically built on sponsorship, right? So people looked at your brand. They said, hey, Tracy McGrady, Vince Carter, Kobe Bryant, Ray Allen, the stars of that era. And they say, hey, we like your quote unquote brand, right? I'm willing to pay you a sum to leverage that brand as part of a sponsorship. Now, it was a very transactional relationship, right? You hired an agent got you these deals, agent got a cut of the deals, you got a lump sum of money for leveraging your likeness to that brand, but that was it, right? That was the extent of your financial relationship. Now, if you look at LeBron James, he did a couple things differently, right? One of the first things he did was he fired his agent. So I don't have any clip notes in front of me. I love what he's done for business, right? So I just know this off the top of my head. But he was one of the first people to really, he hired I remember correctly, his agent at the time was Aaron Godwin, and he fired him to build a representation / marketing company built off his friends, right? So if you look at who he's managed by, who handles his business interests, he cut his friends into the game, right? He saw that they had the potential to be something bigger than they were, and he took the investment to say, you know what, I'm going to trust you guys to do what's right about my career and to build together, as opposed to having somebody else from outside my family kind of handle my interests in that regard, right? So that was the first step. If you look at the second one, I mean, there's a lot of different business moves he made throughout the years, but if you look at the lump sum of what he's done, right? The biggest shift that he's had is he stopped trading his name for a lump sum of money and he started asking for equity.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So there's a very big difference in that, right? And you're seeing a lot of people gravitate towards that as sort of a norm, but that wasn't the norm when you first started doing that, right? Why have a transactional relationship with a proven brand? In his case, LeBron James, right? One of the most famous, recognizable athletes in the world that is producing on the court, that can guarantee you X amount of whatever the number is, right? Whether it's viewership, whether it's streams, whether it's sales, whatever the case may be, for basically a very, I keep using the word transactional, but the way I look at transactional is it's a one-time investment, right? So you don't share in the upside, right? And there's a very big difference in being able to look at the upside of a financial arrangement where you share in a downside if there is some risk associated with it, but you don't get to see the peak aspect of it, right? You basically capture earnings by basically saying, you give me X amount of dollars and we're good, right? So think about this. So one of the first, if you guys remember, one of the first campaigns that he had was a Sprite, right? So let's take I'm going to throw some random numbers out there, just kind of give you some context in terms of how his relationship might have been built. But let's say his relationship with Sprite paid him $1 million a year.
Okay.
Right? And the way Sprite sold the deal to him was, hey, we sell, 70 million, I'm just going to throw a number out there, right? Let's say 70 million cans of Sprite in any given year, right? We think by you working with us, we think that we can sell, 7 more million cans of Sprite than we could any other time. Now, if you're LeBron James, right, and you're looking at how popular you are, you're probably thinking, hey, I could probably sell more than 7 million cans, right? Why not share in the risk? If I'm willing to give you some sort of guarantee that says, if I don't hit 7 million, you don't have to pay me $1 million a year, right? You pay me $500,000. But if I can sell you 20 million cans of Sprite, right? That $1 million a year, all right, let's say it has a variable component to it where now you start paying me 3, 4x times whatever number of cans are, right? So you get to share in the financial rewards that come from an arrangement. That's what he started doing. If you look at a lot of his quote unquote partnerships now, there's an equity interest there, right? The incentives between the brand and him, right, as the persona are mutually aligned. Where he does well, they do well. Where they do well, he does well as well, and he gets to reap those rewards, which is big because that's how you make money, right? That's how you build wealth, right? You no longer become rich. You no longer pay $1 million a year. You start looking at linear sources of income year over year over year because you have equity interest in the actual assets. So that's big. If you look at why he's probably going to be, he's probably one of the biggest earning athletes of all time after Jordan anyways. But if you look at why he's probably going to be a billionaire, around the time he retires, is because he has equity interest in companies, right? Like, think about how smart it is for him. I remember one of the things I was really struck out by him a couple of years ago was when he decided to hire a marketing agency, right? A partnership with a marketing firm. He decided to partner with Fenway Sports Group and their marketing agency. Now, you're probably thinking, what's Fenway Sports Group, right? They're the ownership group that owns the Boston Red Sox, hence the name Fenway. But they also own Liverpool Football Club, right? One of the more recognizable soccer names in England, if not the world, right? So they won the Champions League last year. They're leading the English Premier League this year by 25 points. They've got recognizable names like Mohamed Salah, Sadio Mane. The U.S. market may not be attuned to them, but these are global superstars, right? Huge, huge brands. Now, what he ended up doing was, in addition to striking a mutually beneficial relationship where, they basically said, hey, we have openings, we have connections that allow you to leverage your openings, your brand with, movie companies, with agencies, right? They also gave him a 2% equity interest in Liverpool Football Club.
Oh.
Right? Now, think about that. Now, you may be thinking, what is 2%, right? How big is 2% in the grand scheme of things, right? 2% is a lot when you realize, I think Liverpool Football Club is worth somewhere between $2.5–3 billion a year, right? So what's better for you, getting a one-off $2 million check or getting 2% of a continuously rising, right, ownership structure valuation for a team that is dominating their particular sport, right? So things like that, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, they're no-brainers now. I think the athletic community, the media community, to be quite frank, the African-American community, right? If you look at how, generally speaking, we look at sort of the business relationship between the icons we put on a pedestal relative to what they're doing, take these as sort of no-brainers now, right? You hear about all the time, people talk about, I own myself, right? I want something that represents equity in return for what I'm willing to give to you. These things weren't common 15 years ago, right? It took somebody that's willing to take a step out there and say, you know what, I'm willing to share in the downside, which is I may not be as good and popular as you guys may think I am, but if I'm going to share in the downside, I want the upside too, right? I want that big pool of money that you guys are giving me access to, which is what we call wealth, right? That's how you set up your family for generations.
Yeah, dude, I would never hate on LeBron when it comes to breaking the mold. In particular, and I believe that was probably strategic at the time. I kind of heard some murmurings on YouTube about it, but I remember when LeBron went to Miami, right? He was the Golden Boy when he went to Miami. I'm sorry, when he was with Cleveland and we went to Miami. At that point, you either love him or you hate him, but you were on one side of the spectrum. I was on the side that hated, right?
Right.
But me thinking back, that was one of the better and more competitive times because you had to watch, all of those different series they had with, Dallas Mavericks or the Spurs and all of those, and then he goes back.
Right.
And I heard someone say that he became the bad guy on purpose, right?
Right.
While you're watching him closely from the business aspect, do you think that's something foreign to him? And how did you see that as him kind of manipulating his brand to make more money? But at the end of the day, he was able to come back to Cleveland. I guess he was a good guy again. So how did your business brain see all those transactions? See, that's why you like him so much more than me, because I watch it. I just look at the jump shot, right? When you look at right. you see buckets, but you see the chi-ching when it's going through the rim.
I mean, look, the easy way I can answer that question is, winning solves everything.
Yeah.
Right. Winning solves everything in athletics, and it solves everything, generally speaking, in business as well. Right. So, look, I don't think he materially changed who he was as a person on purpose. Right. So I don't think when he went to Miami, I don't think he put on a cape and said, hey, I'm going to be Batman for the next, X years of my career until I win a ring. Right. I think just the sheer hoopla of all the shit around him. Right. If you look at just the sheer amount of attention, the negativity, right, between the people that loved him still for who he was and the rest of the country that said, hey, you know what, this doesn't seem like the right move for you. You're jumping on a bandwagon. It was, I remember like it was yesterday, right? It was one of the first times I'm glued to ESPN, right? I go to our website almost every single day. And I have most of my life. And it was the first time I can remember ESPN having a dedicated section to just a team, right? They had multiple beat writers and a cameraman, right? Brian Windhorst, right? He basically flew around the country following LeBron as a dedicated person to covering that team, right? Now you multiply that by every other non-ESPN, outlet out there, and you can get a sense of how much all this, sort of craziness around him started developing. So he probably did feel to a certain extent, hey, look, they're making me to be a bad guy. I'm gonna prove them wrong, and I'm gonna dog them, right? And I think within a year, he probably, sort of changed his tune and said, that's not who I am. And he's been on the record of saying that, right? He said, I became somebody I wasn't, and I had to change back to somebody I didn't want to be. And obviously, the proof is in the pudding, right? He's won ring since then. But, the general takeaway for me is, winning solves everything, right? Sure. I'm a big proponent of, I tell my teams at work all the time, right? I'm in the business of structuring deals. That's what I do, right? I sell deals. A client comes to me with a problem. They associate a certain amount of trust and integrity and quite honestly, value out of what I have to provide to them. And they say, can you solve this problem for me? And can that solution make sense for me from a technology perspective and also from a financial perspective, right? And I marry those two together. Now, I'm pretty aggressive in terms of how much risk I'm willing to take, because risk I associate with reward, right? So I don't do things needlessly. I get as much data as I can. I incorporate all the variables I can, right? The people, the technology, the process, everything in one fell swoop to really understand two things, right? One is, what can I do? The fundamental truth is, what can I do right for my client, right? So I fundamentally believe if you do right by your client, everything else will pay off 100 times in return, right? So now, that's the first guiding criteria that.
When you say your client, do you mean your current boss or your current company or your company's client? When you say that client.
No. So when I say client, right, I work for a company, but I spend 99% of my day serving clients of that company.
Okay,
right?
Gotcha.
What I was going to was, you do right by your client, but the second part of it is, it goes back to what you're saying about LeBron, which is, I'm willing to take a risk, right? Almost universally, I want to say as a unilateral rule, but I'm always willing to take a risk if I understand what the trade-offs are, because the reward is always going to be multiple times greater than if you don't take the risk in the first place, right? So as long as you're making a calculated decision and you're incorporating, sort of logical, smart decision-making around it, I'm comfortable with the trade-offs associated with risk. And I think somebody like a LeBron probably makes the same decision when he's making a move like this, right? He's looking at the status quo, which is, I can pull up Kevin Garnett, stay in cold-ass Cleveland for the next 15 years of my career. The stupid-ass owner's not going to give me shit of talent anyways, but he'll spend some money and I'll be a hero forever, but no rings to show for it. Or I take a risk, right? I join two of my best friends. I go down to Miami. I have to trust on Pat Riley to build a team around me. I have to trust myself to build a foundation along with, Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh to do what's right. And if that risk pays off, the rewards are going to be infinitely better for me than if I had stayed on the current path that I'm on. And as a general rule of thumb, I always encourage people, take that path, right? Whether it's a different job, whether it's an opportunity within the career that you have, whatever the case may be, right? You don't grow by comfort, right? That's a general rule of thumb. If you're comfortable doing what you're doing, you're probably not doing right? Or you're at a stage in your life where comfort's okay for you, right? As long as the paycheck's coming in, and you got a 9 to 5 and you're good with it, that's fine, right? But for people that have the natural thirst to be as good as they can, right? To really hit the peak of who their intellectual capabilities can get them to, or in this case, physical capabilities, you only get there by taking chances, right? You only get there by pushing the limits of what you think your capabilities can take you to.
Wow. Were you watching the deal when what was it? The NBA partnered with, what was it, China, and then everybody started getting all these crazy NBA contracts. One summer it was like not OJ Mayo, Mike Conley. I think he got like 157 million for like 3 years. Shout out Mike Conley, but everybody was getting paid crazy money.
Yeah.
Years ago, what was that all about?
That was in China, right? Oh, I mean, okay, so third degree removed is China, but not really, right? So the primary breadwinner, right, for this is a good rule of thumb for a sports fan, generally speaking. If you're the primary revenue source for any professional league, right, is not fans buying, tickets to go to a game. It's not us buying jersey, right? It's not us doing anything other than tuning in and watching our TV, right? So sports leagues and it's a cyclical effect, right? So the leagues and the teams and the players, right? It's a downstream effect of revenue. Make, I would say, somewhere between 60-70% of their revenue based on consumer interest in watching their games live on TV, right? So there's two forces at play here. This is a part where my business brain gets a little too much, right? So if I'm talking to, if I'm going too broad, let me know. But there's two forces that were affecting the NBA at the time in their benefit, right? One is consumers are no longer paying for TV, right? So cable TV is not a thing as much as it used to be when we were growing up, right? So when when I was a kid, right? I mean, you had a cable package. Your parents might have, footed the extra bill for HBO or Showtime if they're feeling a little froggy. My parents weren't, because they're, a little too cheap and they're African. But, I had other friends that were Americans that, you had cable bills that were stretching out to $150, $200, right?
Yeah.
And you had an industry, right, that was built on basically a linear progression of where those fees are going, right? So the basic math was really simple, right? They bundled together all these packages, right? So sports, entertainment, it could be live content, movies, whatever the case may be. All these different TV shows were bundled together, and they're packaged towards a consumer that paid a flat fee, right? Now, what ended up happening was non-linear, what they call them non-linear formats of TV watching, right? So they became the over-the-top players. They became the sort of standalone TV packages that you could buy as a one-off. Started becoming compelling because people started realizing that cable bills were, one, expensive, and two, you were starting to get all these channels that nobody ever tuned to, right? Nobody went to channel 152 to watch Hallmark TV. You were tuned into some other random stuff, right? So long story short, cable bills were starting to become too much. People started cutting. They call them, cable cutters, right? They pull the cord. They say, I'm not going to pay for this cable anymore. I'd rather just not have TV than have it. And they started seeing an accelerating trend of declining revenues, right, when it came to TV. Now, that's good and bad in one way, right? So if you're a TV company, right, if you're if you're Comcast, if you're Verizon, and you're looking at this and going, holy crap, right, I'm going to be struggling here. I got to figure out something else to do. The natural solution actually ended up being sports, right? And sports got a couple things going in its favor. And this is I'll go back to your question about why the contracts became so valuable at that point, or they started rising a lot faster, I should say, was because sports is it's a format that you consume live, right? Nobody is, and you can tell right now, right? They're showing all the classics from 20 years ago that nobody's watching. But nobody's going to watch the national championship game, the college football game, 3 days after the fact, right? You want to watch it at that time. That's why it's valuable. And the other thing sports has going for itself is there's a lot of games on, right? The NBA shows 82 games a season, right? You times that by 30 teams across a 9-month season, and it's a massive volume of content you can put on TV, because consumers are still willing to pay for sports. It became one of the key mechanisms of holding on to cable subscribers, right? So their contracts started expiring at a perfect time for them, right? If you look at it, 2016, 2017, this is around the time where you started seeing a increasingly exponential decrease in revenue subscriptions, right? It wasn't a hey, we're losing 50,000 people here, 50,000 there. It was, the AT&Ts and the Verizons of the world saying, hey, look, we're losing 500,000 consumers a quarter. Right? So how do you keep these people on board? You have to give them enough content that they wanted to pay for, and sports became one of the primary mechanisms to do so. So long story short, the NBA TV contracts were expiring around the same time. Their main partner, ESPN, as you know, is owned by Disney, right? Disney is one of the largest conglomerates in the world. The biggest driver of Disney's profits, people don't know this, right? For past 20 years, it didn't come from movies, it didn't come from theme parks, it didn't come from what you associate Disney brands with, right? It came from a small little part of their empire called ESPN.
What?
ESPN drove a majority of their profits for about 15 years. It was basically somewhere between 30 to 40% of their overall worth as a company, right? So there was no way in hell Disney was going to lose the rights to any content, right? They were bidding left and right for any live TV content. It didn't matter if it was MMA. It didn't matter if it was, well, they gave up on hockey and baseball because the sports suck between me and you. But when it came to the NBA, right, they saw a young, increasingly diverse demographic that was seeing exponential interest in the sport because you had, not just the LeBrons and the Kevin Durants of the world, but you had a huge sort of middle class of young up and coming talent that they saw basically being nurtured over the next 5 to 10 years. And they saw this league's not going anywhere, right? So you saw, I think it was, I forget what the TV contracts are worth, but you saw, I think it was like a 60, 70% increase in their annual TV rights, right? So when that much money comes into the league at one point, right, the salary cap has a direct correlation to league revenues, right? It's an X percentage of league revenues is their salary cap. So when you go all of a sudden from making X amount of dollars to X plus 60%, your salary cap goes from X amount of dollars to X plus 60%. So if you happen to be born at the right time, enter the league at the right draft, sign the right length of contract, and go into free agency at the right time, right, you became the Jan Mahimis of the world, right? The Wizards paid Doofus $70 million over 4 years, right? You started seeing these crazy contracts. Like my colleague became the highest paid player in the league for a year, right? Because he signed a 5-year, I want to say it was $200 million contract, right? So you started seeing this massive wave of contracts being increasing, but it wasn't really fair to most of the players, right? So a lot of the players that were in free agency at the time got to capture that pool of money at one given time. It wasn't spread over, evenly throughout a couple of number of years, but just being one big pool of money, which as a footnote ended up becoming how Kevin Durant was able to sign with the Golden State Warriors, right? So the Golden State Warriors had a once in a lifetime opportunity. They had Steph Curry and Draymond Green and Klay Thompson, right, making non-max contracts. So while they were pushing up against the old salary cap in terms of how much they could spend, all of a sudden, right, new TV contract comes into place. They had a nice little $32 million cushion available to them to spend on salary cap, right? So who do they go after? Kevin Durant. Any other time in league history, if it wasn't for that one particular year, they could never sign him.
That's crazy, dude. Woo, man.
I told you, hey, you start talking business with a couple more rings and see what happens.
Man, to kind of go back to the entrepreneurship piece.
Yeah.
On a basic level, what do you think are the 3 key concepts that somebody should concentrate on if they're looking at going into a business, like a solo type business for themselves? Like just the top 3 concepts of the things that they should look at and the questions that they should be asking themselves.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, so I'm not sure about concepts, but I'll give you the 3 like traits / I guess you can call them concepts, right? So I look at this from the mechanism of how I look at eventually when I want to start my own business, what do I need to have in place for me to feel comfortable doing something, right? So one, and this is a, I think this is a trap that some people fall. So I'm not sure how common it is, but you actually have to believe in what you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the fundamental reason why I haven't become an entrepreneur yet, right, in a typical sense, or I haven't started a company yet, is because I haven't felt passionate enough about an idea or a concept that I wanted to do and that there was a demand in the marketplace for, right? Okay. So I think those 2 things are mutually exclusive. I don't think you can do one or the other. Now, can I start a company around an idea that I'm not 100% passionate about, but I'm somewhat intrigued by? Sure, right? But there has to be some level of interest in the idea. And the second part is there has to be a demand for it, right? So I have friends and I've seen people that they just don't want to work for somebody, or they don't they want to start a company, or they want to do what you described earlier, right? They want to quote unquote build a brand as an entrepreneur, mm-hmm. and which is fine, right? I mean, to each their own, but there has to be a want in the marketplace for it, right? I mean, if you look at what a business is, a business addresses an inequality in the marketplace, right? It's either an opportunity to arbitrage demand and supply, right? So somebody is not matching the right supply and demand for a particular product, a good or a service, or somebody is going to the market. And look, I use the term market very liberally, right? I mean, the market is basically, if I'm looking to buy something, where do I go to, right? So part of it is what I described to you, which is arbitrage, right? There's a difference in terms of how a supply and demand are being met. Or the second part of it is that service doesn't exist, right? I go to the market and I say, hey, I want to buy this from somebody, or I want this from somebody. You look around, it doesn't exist, right? Now, this sounds really easy to say, right? Because obviously there's literally millions and millions of different, goods, services, products, brands, companies that are being, built, bought, exchanged, sold at any given time. But that fundamentally has to happen, right? Now, the second part of it is, and it's something that a lot of people have reiterated to me over and over again, but I don't think you're going to experience until you're put in that position, which is only the strong survive.
Okay.
Right? You got to persevere. There are a lot of reasons why an idea may not work out for you, right? It may not work out because it's just not a good idea, right? That's always a fundamental concept. But it also could not be working out because it's too far ahead of its time, or it's not in the right place at the right time, or you don't have enough cash to start it, or whatever the case may be, right? But if you look at almost any different industry, right? I'll take my, my personal heroes, for example, right? Now, I work in enterprise tech, but my personal heroes are people I gravitate to culturally, right? It's the LeBron James of the world. It's the Jay-Z's of the world, right? It's people that have built a business off their backs. And if you take away the natural talent that they had, right, which is athletics and the ability to make great music, why have they survived is because they persevere to build a brand, right, that people would have looked at and foolishly said, you know what, I don't think that's actually a good idea. Why would anybody want to buy this thing from you, right? Why would the marketplace ask for something like this? If you look at any different, I'll take a more recent example, right? One of my favorite companies is Tesla, right? I for lack of a better term, I am a huge fan of Elon Musk, and I love the company, right? I drive a Model 3. It's my baby. You've been in the car. You called it a spaceship, right? But if you look at where Tesla started to where they are today, right? They should have failed any number of different times, right? They should have failed. I mean, literally, you could probably bank on at least, more than fingers in a hand, the number of times they should have failed as an organization, or at least bought out by somebody because Elon can, continue funding it. And if you read his biography, if you read back into the interviews over a period of time, if you look at the fundamental reason why they haven't failed, is because the guy just refused to give up. He worked 20, 24-hour days, weeks at a time. He did what was necessary to make sure that what he thought was a fundamentally groundbreaking and potentially life-saving, technology / product, or in this case, good, right, had a chance to persevere. Now, if you look at where they started with the Roadster, right, their entire business model was built on, let me build an elite supercar, use the profits from that to reinvest back in the business, keep scaling it out, right, make a sort of an everyday car like a Model 3, right, a sedan, move on to SUVs, from SUVs, move on to trucks, move on from trucks, becoming to basically a full range provider of vehicles. At any given point during the ecosystem, he should have failed, right? And he still could fail, right? If you look at where he is, right now, they've launched the Model 3, right? They have the SUV launched already, but they're moving on to the next wave, which is moving on to trucks. But they still fundamentally can't manufacture enough cars compared to the way Ford or General Motors has been doing this for hundreds of years. So perseverance to me is big, right? You got to believe in it, right? You got to believe when 100 people look at you in the face and say, hey, look, you're dumb as hell, man. This is not going to work. You're stupid. You're throwing good money after bad. You have to believe that you're doing the right thing, right? Within the logic of your framework in your head, that you have to keep moving forward. Now, the last piece of this is, and this is something I believe in whether I'm an entrepreneur or not, right? I can't do everything by myself, right? Okay. You own a business by yourself. I'm pretty sure you understand you can't do everything by yourself. No. One of the fundamental things I grasped pretty early on, right, when you talk about the call center that I ran early on, was you got to have a right team around you, man. You got to surround yourself with people that are smarter than you, people that are willing to tell you no, people that think they know better than you but are willing to back it up with the facts. Because at the end of the day, one person can't do it by himself, right? You can't build a company, and you sure as hell can't scale it. So I take a lot of pride in, and my friends will laugh at this, right? Because I do come off as very confident. I can be brash, right? Especially when I believe in something. But I fundamentally try to bite my ego and humble myself and try to listen to others and learn from them, because I don't think I'm very good at a lot of things. I think a lot of people are better at certain skill sets and certain traits than I personally am capable of doing. So if you want to build a business, right, think about it. If you're going to scale an organization, An idea is not good enough, right? You need somebody that runs your finances, somebody that runs operations, somebody that does supply chain, somebody that does HR, right? Somebody that if you're a product company, right, who's going to actually be the product manager for something, right? Look, I can maybe do one of those jobs if you give me like a year or two to learn. I can't scale across all those, right? The way the organization as a whole, grows and nurtures itself is to have individual leaders capable of being best in breed at each one of those functions, right? So if I'm fortunate enough to be in a position, right, whether it's tomorrow, 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, where, the first two things happen, right, which is I think I have an idea for something the marketplace can address, right, or I can arbitrage something that people are doing but not doing efficiently, and I put my capital at stake, or I get capital from other people to invest in that initial concept, and I persevere through that initial stage, right? The last piece of it is I got to have people that are smart and capable of doing it. I'll be honest with you, right? This is where LeBron comes back in the picture. As funny as it may sound to a lot of people, I trusted my friends, right? I have a lot of friends and people that I've known throughout the years that I fundamentally trust first and foremost, but they just also happen to be very good at what they do, right? They have the natural, I look at it as a piece of clay, right? You put somebody that has a lot of common sense, logic, hard work, and can just do things because they know they have to do it, right? You can give them a piece of clay and say, you know what, I want a statue in 24 hours. And they're going to figure it out, man. No matter how it is, doesn't matter how many hours it's going to take, doesn't matter if they're, running short of the clock, but they're going to figure out how they're going to do it, right? And you need all three of those, I think, to succeed. But, I only know what I know, right? I haven't done it myself yet, so other people will tell you differently.
Dude, so we got believe in what you're doing. Number 2, only the strong survive. 3, building a strong team. You mentioned somewhere in between 2 and 3. Could you explain what you've seen or commonality between companies who start off small and who were able to scale, and kind of explain to people what scaling is?
Yeah. So I should say I actually hate the word scale, right? So if there are certain buzzwords in technology that people use all the time that they're really bratty, they come off as really Silicon Valley-esque, which makes sense, right? If you live in California, you've been there for a while, you gravitate towards those kind of words. But if you read and listen to enough things, certain words and nomenclature keep rising up back and forth. Now, the term scale, I mean, fundamentally it's pretty easy, right? It's how do you take something that has a user base, right? So number of users that use a product, a good, a service, or customer base, people that buy something from you, from this little box that you have here, right? Which could be 100 people, could be 500 people, could be 1,000 people. And scale means how do you get it from that initial base to exponentially grow to the, to something that's going to be a factor of 10, 20, 30x that, right? So, scaling isn't how do you get from 1,000 people to 10,000 people. It's how do you get from 1,000 people to 1,000,000 people. Right? Does that answer the question, or do you want to jump a little deeper?
No, yeah. That sound effect just came out. I saw it in my brain. So, to all of those solo practice lawyers that we have here, and one thing that I see in our practice a lot, especially in Northeastern North Carolina, is you have someone who believes in the work that they do. They work hard for their clients. They definitely have persevered from whatever situation that they've been in. Most lawyers are advocates by nature, so we're pretty tough for the most part. But to those who start their own practice, there's not many who actually look for the help, and it's maybe it's partially because of the trust factor that you spoke about before. If someone builds something from the ground up, meaning starting with them with not much help, they're not willing to kind of come in, take a back seat, maybe too much of an ego, maybe just, not trusting people. But, I think from a mental health perspective, man, I don't know what the shelf life is for a super professional that's actually working those 60-hour weeks. But I gotta think after 5 or 6 years, man, there's gotta be a peak where you're not being productive anymore. And I didn't get my MBA. I just can speak from
experience,
and I can be totally motivated and work hard for only so long before I'm going through the motions again. And it just so happened maybe I mastered the skill, but that's not even touching on the business side, right? That's actual law work that we're doing. And I think, I don't know, do you have any thoughts about minorities and solo entrepreneurs in our inability to team up and work together? What do you think? Is that a cultural thing, or is it something I'm making up as I'm sitting here talking to you right now?
No, it's definitely a cultural thing.
Because I do see a lot of people in areas where I just don't understand why they have not teamed up. You know, I see like, you're doing amazing, and you're doing amazing, and you guys barely speak to each other. But but you come from the same demographic and the same type of background and everything. Like, what's going on, dude?
No, look, this is not a. You are 100% spot on. Look, I'll be honest with you, right? I mean, when I look at, let's use technology for example, right?
Okay.
When I look at, so I look at myself, right? So I work for a big company, right? So it's not like I work in an entrepreneurship space right now, but I work in technology, and relatively speaking, we work with small, medium, tall players all across the board, right? So anybody from a startup to a medium-sized player, all the way to, the Microsofts, Amazons of the world, right? Now, if you look at that ecosystem that's been built up, I am an anomaly by virtue of my race, right, and my age. So you don't see a lot of Black people in tech, and you sure as hell don't see a lot of young Black people in tech either, for whatever reason. Now, if I think about that, right, I mean, a big part of why I'm in it is because we talked at the beginning of the podcast, right? I was fortunate enough to grow up in an environment that gave me every opportunity in the world to learn, right? So these worlds they didn't exist to me in a day-to-day life, but they were within my universe. It wasn't outlandish for me to think about the fact that these worlds exist, right? So, by virtue of being exposed to these different, sort of worlds that my parents exposed me to, right? I generally knew what ecosystem was around me. And as I got to be older and I went to undergraduate, I went to school, right? I went to college and I started working, and I started, kind of observing the world around me, how my dad worked in that world, how, the Northern Virginia sort of ecosystem of people that went to school there, what my friends were doing. This wasn't a foreign universe to me, right? Now, it was still up to me to take advantage of those opportunities. It was still up to me to learn. It was still up to me to understand what this world entailed, right? All the way from who these big companies were to what does it mean to have a startup, and how do you fund it? How do you nurture it? How do you build it? How do you see examples of companies that have made it and have scaled, right? Using that term that we discussed earlier, and others that didn't scale but are still successful companies that have done well for themselves, all the way to the ones that have failed, right? So, it's a tremendous amount of research, right? I breathe and live this. I read it for passion, for a living. I immerse myself in it. But the reason I'm able to do that is because I knew it existed.
Okay.
Right. So going back to your question about, what is it about, our culture that maybe doesn't lend itself to that sort of, relationship building maybe, or that sort of exposure. The truth of the matter is, right, if you look at, this goes back to not just technology or just business in general, but really how the country as a whole has enabled people of color and people of diverse backgrounds to enter the business world. Not every ecosystem is built the same, right? Not every individual has the same opportunities afforded to them, right? And it's really unfortunate because if you look at the statistics out there, right, if you're a Caucasian, if you're Black, if you're Spanish, if you're Asian, if you're anything in between, there are indicators out there in terms of what you're exposed to at a young age, what your what the sort of quote unquote, your ability to matriculate from high school, your ability to go to college and graduate within 4 years, your ability to graduate with less student debt than others if you're white as opposed to being Black, the number of people that go to business school as opposed to not, the number of people that are in position of leadership by a certain age. It starts early enough where if you don't hit that, if you don't catch that wave and that momentum early enough, you almost inevitably can't buy back that time. All right. And I was fortunate enough at a young age where I started building a little momentum of myself at a younger age, where if I look at myself and where I am today in a position of leadership at a company where I understand how these things are done, I see a future for myself in, a couple of years where I could be a vice president or a CEO of a company, or I could own my own company and I can do these certain things because these are not foreign concepts to me, right? They were built into me at a young age. Now, the reason I say that is because our communities traditionally have been unserved, right? They've been disadvantaged. So I don't look at this as individuals, right? I don't look at it as, hey, you're a black lawyer here, you're a black lawyer there. Why not merge it together, right? So for example, I'll give you an example, right? One of my best friends is, he lives in Los Angeles. He moved there with his now fiance, his then girlfriend, a couple of years ago, and he owns his own company. And he started doing a little good for himself about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And he told me he was pretty excited. He said, "Hey, I just signed up 5 clients. He owns a marketing company, so he builds applications for them. He does their social media campaigns for them, marketing campaigns of all sorts." And he had come to me and said, "Hey, I'm doing really good. What can you tell me about sales? What would you do in this situation?" Kind of picking my brain. And at the time, I'd been considering leaving IBM, so I had a little free time on my hands.
All right, now he's not an MBA.
No. I went to business. I went to VCU with him, right? So we've known each other since college. And look, he's a smart guy, right? He grew up in the same ecosystem as me. He's black, same environment as me, same college as me. And when he started telling me about some of the challenges he's facing, I was kind of walking through some of this, and I said, "Hey, look, part of the challenge you're probably facing is business development, right? You spend a lot of time on your end trying to find clients." I told him, "Hey, look, maybe I can come work for you, right? You're not going to pay me anything, but let's give me some equity, right? I will allocate X percentage of my time in return for basically risk reward. You don't owe me anything if I don't do anything for you, but if I do get something for you, let's come to a mutual agreeable terms for me to build a customer base for you and be part of an organization." I looked at this for myself as a mechanism to say, "Hey, look, if this company can succeed and I can help them succeed, maybe I end up working there, right? Becoming a co-founder or kind of scaling that organization up as opposed to doing my own thing, right?" So I'm open to, you hear enough about those ideas where you realize a lot of times to be a founder of a company, you don't have to come up with the idea yourself, right? You can just scale somebody else, give them your expertise, give them that expertise.
Catch a wave.
Yeah, give them a piece of expertise they might not have.
Yeah.
Now, the conversation died pretty soon, right? I mean, he basically said, he's like, "Oh, it's stupid." It's like, I'm never giving up any interest in my company, no ownership shares, no equity. I want to own it all by myself. And I said, "You know what? I respect it. What's making you think that way?" And he goes, "No, it's like I've never seen anybody around me, right, give up ownership in a company organization and have it turn out successful." Now he works in marketing/technology. So I told him, "Look, man, if you look at any startup worth its name or any technology company worth its name, right, the founders at best, right, have single digits to maybe double digit ownership stake in the company, right? The rest are diluted over a period of time between venture capitalists, different ownership stakes. By the time you have to start attracting talent to scale, you have to give them equity in return for getting the talent, because why would they otherwise join, right? They want the reward for taking the risk." And it dawned on me the more I started having these conversations, especially with young black men, right? It sounds weird saying young black men because I'm young and black myself, but the more I started talking to my peers and my brethren and people around me, you start realizing that the way I look at the world and the way I've always envisioned how business and technology works are not things that they've been exposed to. And it used to be really frustrating for me when I was younger, because I remember thinking, I was like, man, the same information is available to you, right? I'm reading publicly available information. I'm not like hunting, I'm not going out of my way to figure this stuff out. Why do you not all understand this, right? Why are we not all on the same page as it relates to building something together? And it dawns on you that, you can't be mad at somebody for not having ever been exposed to something, You can't look at an entire community of people without first educating them and opening the doors in their eyes to what may be available before you start running your way back and saying, "Okay, now that you know what's out there and you still choose not to do it, then we got a problem," right? But if you don't know what's out there, if you don't know the right way to do things, right, and you haven't been exposed or educated into how other people are doing it, is that your fault, or is that society as a whole for failing you in that regard, right? Because the U.S. likes to think that our public education system is created equally, right? But it's really not. It's really not. And I think fundamentally we are a disadvantage in terms of how we look at our careers, how we look at business, how we look at building something for ourselves. Because unless you happen to live in the right ecosystem, like I was fortunate enough to, along with my friends, you don't know any better. So I don't fault them for that. I think, there's a huge responsibility upon the shoulders of those that do understand it to not get frustrated and to do their level best, to not necessarily educate people, but to show them that it's out there, right? I think the best way to tell people that there's an alternative to the universe that you explored is to have people in their ecosystems thrive, right? As somebody like yourself that is thriving and is eager to seek knowledge in terms of how they can do better for themselves, that eventually you start, going from a single practice, law firm to all of a sudden you start scaling out and owning, a wider range of a law firm with different partners involved, where people start looking at you and saying, shit, that guy Johnny did it. Why can't I do it? Right? It's no different in other industries too. If you look at tech, right? There's obviously successful black men in technology, right? I will never do a disservice saying there isn't. We don't have our LeBron, right?
No.
We don't have our Jay-Z. We don't have somebody we can naturally gravitate towards and say, that's my guy, right? If he can do it, I can do it too. So until you start seeing a sort of a northern star, right? The shining light of somebody that you can aspire to be, you're not going to see that cascading effect to the wider community because they don't know any better.
Man, dude, thinking over, just my career, you were just speaking about how we tend to not want to team up. I know, and we talk about it a lot. Oh, well, I talk about it over and over again. I guess I'm the main one that's talking most of the time on this channel, but about mental health and how our workload becomes unbearable at times and how we become unproductive. Through the course of like your studying and in a high performing career like yourself, what type of things do you do to maintain your mental health, or you just really don't think about it? Or
I think about it a lot. That's actually a really
why
good
is
question.
that? Is that because you said about 10 years younger than myself? That's not something that we really talked about.
Right.
And shoot, the first time I heard it was, a couple years ago. Really, black guys just don't focus on mental health. And you say you think about it all the time. Obviously, high functioning. How do you deal with mental health and even so that everybody else is around you is doing pretty well?
Yeah. No, look, it's fundamentally, in order for me to do good at what I do, right, my job, and not just my professional career, but my personal career, right, how I'm able to give a part of myself to my girlfriend, to my family, to my friends, I have to be at a functioning capacity, right? I've got to have a certain level of clarity and energy in order for me to provide those things to the people around me.
Capacity, is that 50, 60, 70? What do you think?
So let me let me give you an example, right? So I probably work, somewhere between 60, 70 hours a week, right? On crazy weeks, I can maybe go up to 80, on an average week, if things are going relatively light, maybe it's 50, 45 on a light week. So, and this is what I set up for, right? I mean, this is the job that I have. It's a demanding position, right? I wear multiple hats in my job, and I serve multiple clients and multiple stakeholders within the organizations. So I'm always, by the time I wake up, at 6:30 in the morning, I've got emails flying in from literally all parts of the world, right? My team is global in nature. They're based anywhere from London to India to the West Coast to the East Coast, everywhere in the world in between, right? So I fundamentally, as the nature of my job, I'm always on, right? I'm always getting emails. Doesn't matter if it's a weekday or a weekend. It just happens. Now, if I look at that, I could have done what I did when I first started working at IBM, right? Which was, thankfully enough now I'm not traveling as much, but back then I was on the road probably 3 weeks out of the month, right? Literally, I was on a flight. There was times where I'd be gone for 3.5 weeks. I'd be lucky to get home, do my laundry over the weekend, and then I'd be on the road again for Monday, be back for a couple of weeks, right? But I was young. I figured, hey, you guys are paying me to travel the world. Like, this is great, right? I'm gonna enjoy it. I get to drink, party, on top of the job that I have, and people. I was living what I thought was the sort of like the salesman movie job, right?
Yeah,
and I was enjoying it. I was enjoying it thoroughly, right? I mean, I packed down the pounds that come with taking dinner, clients out to steak dinners and buying tables at clubs to celebrate deals, and I was enjoying life, right? But I also ended up gaining 25, 30 pounds, and I quickly realized that the number of hours did not equate to productivity, right? So I wasn't being efficient with how I was working my hours. So what have I done, right? And why did I start doing that? One of it is I hit that cliff that you were talking about, right? I started seeing, after a couple of years, there was diminishing returns on my productivity, right? By working any additional 1, 2, 3 hours, I wasn't getting the same level of output out of it. So it starts hitting you. I'm like, why am I spending this much time on this? Second part of it, I was getting unhealthy, right? I was sacrificing relationships that are important to me. I was gaining weight. I was physically not in a place where I wanted to be, and I had to change that. So I couldn't change the traveling part. I couldn't change the the nature of my job and sort of the 24/7 cycle of it. What I could change was how I treated myself and what was important for me, right? So I got healthy, right? I started losing weight. I started running every day, started lifting, playing basketball. I ran my first marathon last summer for the first time. That the process it takes to get to that level where, I didn't do great at it, but the process it takes to get to a place where you can finish a marathon, it instills a sense of discipline in you in terms of how often you work out, what you eat, how much you sleep, how little, you can start socializing and drinking and going out with your friends. It forces a discipline upon you, right? And I started embracing that. I became a vegetarian. I've been doing it on and off for years. My dad stopped eating meat when I was a kid because he has high cholesterol and diabetic issues like a lot of Black men do. He decided to self-control it for himself, stop eating meat, stop putting sugar, butter, things of that nature in his food. And when I started seeing that, I said, hey, I'd like to support you in that, in doing that. So I was in business school. I actually stopped eating meat. I was a pescatarian. I was eating seafood, but no meat. But I wasn't doing it healthy, right? I was still eating pasta, I was still eating French fries. Like I was working out, but I wasn't as committed to it as I was. But last year, I cut a full turkey. But now, one of the few sort of benefits of being in the pandemic is I cook every day.
Yeah.
Right. I make my own meal. I really focus on getting quality food, quality intake into my body. Now, this wasn't something I came up with myself. It goes back to having people around you, right? My girlfriend's really big into that, right? She's really big in terms of cooking, putting the right ingredients, the right quality stuff into your body, portion control, making sure things aren't too rich. So I started having all that part of my system. And if I look at it now, there's always things I can improve on, right? I mean, I wish I could sleep more. I wish I was more productive throughout the day. But I'm at a place where I'm not overwhelming myself by the sheer nature of how much I work, right? Yeah. So I don't think about the fact that I work a lot anymore because I'm still in a position where I feel like I'm doing the right things to maintain an equilibrium. And in some cases, actually pushing myself to be a little bit better than I would have before, right? If we're still in an environment where I still have to travel and be a client place a lot. So it's critical, man. I mean, if you don't take care of yourself, we're not infallible, right? When I was 16, 17, 18 years old, I thought I was Superman. I could do whatever I wanted. I could drink, eat, party, and do whatever I wanted under the sun. You start getting a little bit older, and you start realizing the workload and how much is on your shoulders, and you realize if you don't take care of yourself, nobody else is going to do it for you, right? And inevitably, it's going to catch up to you.
Sure. Listen, you guys, man, I need you to go all in the comments. And I want everybody to just put the praying hands that we can get Mike back, man. It's a lot going on right now.
I'll be back, man. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed it a lot.
There's a lot going on in the business realm that we have no clue about, but we learned about it today. Man, I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. I hope everybody's doing good. Like I said, I'll post links on the bottom. You guys make sure to comment on the bottom. Let Mike know he needs to come back. We can get into this LeBron Kobe conversation. We can delve into it all, and maybe we can just get them to come back. I appreciate you guys. I'm out. Real Conversations, Lawyer Life. I appreciate you guys. All right, Mike, man, I love you.
Appreciate it, sir. Until next time, man.
Yes, sir.